Welcome to Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, Professor of Geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Karen Kolkazy, Associate Professor of Geography at West Virginia University. Karen, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great trip.
I'm glad. Like we've talked with a number of other people that have been interviewed for this series, always like to ask what maybe interested you in pursuing geography as a field of study, as a career, or if you can reflect upon a time in your childhood when maybe something influenced you.
Yeah, sure. I think it was probably a slow progression. When I was in 7th grade, and like most 7th graders was forced to memorize every capital in Europe and the United States, I was actually thrilled to do it, unlike my fellow classmates. Clearly geography is not memorizing capitals and placing them on maps, but that was something that just always intrigued me. I always had a curiosity of places outside of my own local area. I was always very curious and to kind of explore places. And then it was, like I think a lot of people was in college where that was cultivated. I had a few professors in the geography department at the University of Vermont who were just amazingly critical thinkers and just so diverse in their knowledge, and they just, they piqued my interest, and the rest is kind of history.
So at UVM, who were some of these professors that really captivated you?
There were 3. I was lucky. It was a small department, but still, there were just some amazing professors there. Sadly, 2 of them have actually passed away. Daniel Gady, who was an emeritus professor, he was a Renaissance man, a classic cultural geographer. I think he spoke something like 5 or 6 languages fluently, dabbled in another half a dozen. He traveled the whole world, taking pictures of his Swiss Army pocket knife to give scale to the landscapes, and he just was one of those professors that just opened up the world to me. And then there were 2 other professors.
A Latin Americanist extraordinaire, I might say.
Latin Americanist,
too.
European. He studied everything. He was really incredibly impressive. But then there were 2 other professors that probably have a little bit more kind of deeper impact on my kind of critical thinking skills and a little bit more theoretically. And that was Matt Hanna and Glenn Elder. And Glenn Elder also, he passed away very young, kind of a very sad situation. But I remember taking a Glenn Elder's class on urban geography, and one of the first things he did was get the class out of our classroom and outside, and this was in Vermont, it's cold, and forced us to kind of just look at our landscape around us and think about our subject position and our identities within the landscape, and think about Vermont in the spaces of a campus and how these are very normative spaces of white, male, heterosexual spaces, and how there's violence happens in these places. So he really began to question the places that we were actually in, and it was quite brilliant for me that he actually took us out of the classroom and brought us into this space to think about where we were. And then Matthew Hanna, just hugely influential on my thinking as well. I think he and Glenn were the ones that embedded critical thinking in me, or gave me the tools in order to think critically. And Matt Hanna, just one quick example, he gave a lecture in an intro geography, world region geography class about the diamond trade and diamond commodities. And it impacted me hugely and very significantly when my now husband was kind of beginning to talk about marriage and things like that. I told him, just make sure you don't give me a diamond. And he didn't. And I'm very pleased about that. And then that learning from Matt Hanna, though, has trickled down to my own teaching. And when I teach world regional geography at West Virginia University, I also teach about the diamond commodity chain and kind of critique the diamond market. And I had a student, I've been at WVU for over 8 years now, and I had a student who actually came back after she had graduated for about 2 years, and she came up to me. I didn't recognize her at all, but she came up to me and she was like, Dr. Kolkazy, I wanted to let you know that I recently got married and I refused to let my husband buy me a diamond. So it trickled from Matt Hanna to me to her, and I need to let Matt know. I need to write Matt an email and let him know that he's had an effect on several generations now.
That's great.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, what made you decide to go to UVM?
I grew up in Massachusetts, so I mean, the part of it was just kind of close by. I'm first generation college, so being closest to home was pretty important to me. And I could get to UVM was about a 3-hour drive from where I grew up, so that was important. And I got a scholarship really, and I mean not a full scholarship, but I got a lot of aid because it is a state school, and within the New England system, they actually do support other New England state schools. So I was able to have a pretty nice funding package.
Did you decide on geography immediately?
No, I think like a lot of people, geography came late to me. I actually double majored sociology and geography, and I had declared my sociology major before geography. Geography, I came later, but and it happens. I see that at WVU all the time. Our students come in as majors later. They come in, they think they want to do political science or international studies. Some of them, might be doing engineering, and then they realize that maybe engineering was not what they thought it was, or and they end up coming to geography. We always say that they come to geography late, and I did that as well.
It is rare for one. For a program to have undergraduate students that have selected geography as a major early on.
Yeah.
And they say, my goodness, I didn't know what this is all about.
It's so fascinating, yeah.
This is really good stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, geography in the K through 12 system here has been marginalized. I mean, it's coming back, actually. I think there's a lot more. West Virginia actually has a pretty substantial geography education curriculum in the K through 12 system. So
yeah, the Geographic Alliance in West Virginia has been pretty solid. I guess that was also it was spearheaded, I guess, at Concord for a while,
Joe
wasn't
Manzo.
it, by Manzo? Yeah.
Yep.
It's interesting. So you were at Vermont. You graduated from Vermont, and did you decide immediately to go to graduate school?
I decided that I wanted to go to grad school immediately, but I did not go immediately. I was preparing, and I was actually seeking a lot of advice from Glenn Elder about where to go to grad school. He was definitely my informal mentor on those things. But I actually got a position in the Peace Corps, which I did not go. But that was my next step, and I was prepared to go to Jordan for the Peace Corps. And then a couple of things happened, and they actually pulled out of the Peace Corps, and things happened, so I didn't end up going. And I ended up working for almost 2 years, kind of doing sociology, which was, I had a double major, and I was working in the Boston area for 2 years. But the whole time I was just dying to go back to school. There was just more I needed to study and more I wanted to read and learn. So I went through the process and did the GRE and the application process, and started my master's degree at Syracuse 2 years from when I graduated with my bachelor's degree. So it was a 2-year break I had when I worked professionally.
When you were taking this break, what sorts of things really struck you, perhaps, on a certain day or maybe day to day that made you want to go back to school?
Well, I never needed pushing or encouragement to go back to school. I wanted to. I had talked, I had plans. I had the list of the schools I wanted to apply to before I even left with my undergrad degree. It was really kind of more situational. It was just the Peace Corps not working out, having to work for a while, kind of getting things in order. I mean, going back to school was never a question for me. It was just when it was going to actually happen. And I think at that time, it was time well spent. I actually was able to work doing sociology, which was my other major. I got jobs doing kind of quantitative survey analysis work. So I was actually doing something that I had been studying, but it wasn't geography. And there was no doubt. I mean, maybe that's kind of a better answer to your question. That during that time when I was there and working, I was doing quantitative analysis using SPSS, and it was fine, but it wasn't what I loved, and I wanted to go back for geography.
And so you
you
pursued a master's degree at Syracuse. What did you pursue studies in particularly?
I wanted to do work about politics in the Middle East, and I also like a lot of geographers, just in love with maps. I was at UVM. I had a work study in their map library, and I did that. I did that as a work study, and then they also hired me in 2 different consecutive summers to actually work in the map library as more of a full-time employee, and I loved it. I mean, their maps is what it's when geographers can study any aspect of geography. We can usually come together over the map. So Mark Momonier ended up being my master's and my PhD advisor. He's at Syracuse. And he's pretty well known for being kind of the politics of map guy in the United States, and he publishes a book about every 18 months. His probably most well-known book is How to Lie with Maps, published in was it 1999, I think it was. It's been republished. He had a couple editions of it. It's been translated to different languages. But this book, How to Lie with Maps, I read it as an undergrad, and I was just captivated by it. I mean, it did not have any kind of element of case studies in the Middle East in it, which I definitely did. I do have a regional focus, but still, that politics of maps and understanding the discourse of the map was something I wanted to do. So going to work with Monmonier was a very easy decision to make. One, because of his reputation, and the second, because of what he was actually doing. And third, like I said, Syracuse, from where I grew up, was about 4.5 hours away. So I felt like I was kind of close to home. I was getting a little further away, but I still felt kind of close to home. So I went there, and then I was able to, between my master's and my PhD, to create a committee that gave me the diversity that I needed. So I ended up having somebody on my committee that was an expert in Middle Eastern studies. He was actually in the political science department. Mirza Bourjadi, I mean, he was a fantastic, amazing person to have on my committee to help cultivate that.
That's great. Can you talk about your research, your master's research?
My master's research, that was a long time ago.
That was good stuff.
My master's research, took the idea of Kurdistan, the entity of Kurdistan, and try to understand how the Western world has been mapping it as a ambiguous, entity that doesn't really exist, but it exists to some people, and fundamentally why. And I do this a lot. I've done this with Palestine as well, like taking a spatial entity that exists to some people but not to other people, and then to try to understand how the politics works behind that, how it has to do with ideology and geographical imaginings, and how it embodies people's life and their passions about what they're doing in their politics. I get fascinated with that, these kind of like quasi-existing entities. So I did that with Kurdistan, my master's degree, and I did a really comprehensive analysis really of the media and just the way in which U.S. media has represented Kurdistan. And I mean, of course, it followed historical trends you might think of when there was, certain events, wars, conflicts, U.S. involvement in Iraq. The representations of Kurdistan shifted a little bit. But often there was... there was a tendency to make Kurds look as though they were violent people. Not necessarily violent against Americans. In fact, they were our allies, and they have been. I mean, historically, they've been American allies. But they were never very violently. They were portrayed very violently. And then I did a little bit of kind of subsequent analysis looking at the way that Kurds were actually mapping Kurdistan. And it was different. And the Kurds are really not a very united people, but the northern Iraqi Kurds, I mean, they do have a lot of political power and leadership. So there were a lot of different kind of cartographies and different representations of Kurdistan coming from them. And that then piqued my interest in understanding alternative cartographies, which is what my PhD research was really about. It was not about the Western world and not about how the CIA or how National Geographic or New York Times was mapping these places, but how these places themselves were mapping where they are. And that's kind of how my dissertation evolved.
And you continued to work in the Middle East, and you explored historical maps, and you really ended up developing kind of a treasure trove of documents, of maps in your dissertation.
Yeah, I have a lot of very, very dusty atlases and maps, and I have a lab in my building in West Virginia, and it houses a lot of dusty maps. Yeah. I love them.
So you left Syracuse with a PhD, and you ended up going to?
Professionally, I went to West Virginia. Yeah, I defended my dissertation and got the job right away. So I was pretty lucky. I didn't have that that adjuncting kind of temporary positions. I got right to West Virginia.
And when you're in West Virginia, you ended up kind of refocusing your research a little bit in terms of more social justice issues, I guess, no?
People became really central to my work. So, yeah, the master's degree on Kurdistan, and then my PhD work was not the Kurdistan stuff. It was still archives and maps coming from the Middle East. It was archival research mostly. I mean, recent archives. It was looking at the map and the atlas and doing textual discourse analysis of these things. And I mentioned this briefly in a conversation yesterday, but I started to get some, every once in a while I would submit a paper for review and I get these comments. I was like, well, how do you really know that Watan Arabia, that the Arab homeland, really means something to Arabs? I was making a lot of assumptions by looking at the maps and the texts, and I don't really know the impact they were having on people. And I kind of began to realize, yeah, this is something I need to look into. And luckily, our careers evolve, and they continue and they change. So I had the time to do it. And yeah, so since then, I have received a couple grants to go back, and I've been focusing my work in Jordan pretty much uniformly since being at WVU, where I've actually talked to people about how they think about these places, where I did work with Palestinians, where I asked them questions about, is this image of Palestine here that I have on this map, is this your homeland? And is this your home? And how do you feel about these places, the territory? So I ended up doing kind of a mixed method where I was using the map, but I was actually talking to people about how they felt about the maps and the emotions that it invoked or didn't invoke in them.
And you've also talked with people in Dearborn, Michigan about these things.
I have.
Have you noticed any differences in terms of the perceptions of members of the Palestinian population in Dearborn compared with those perhaps in Jordan?
There are striking similarities and a few differences. That sense of passion for the homeland is so strong. The Palestinians that I met and interviewed in Dearborn are also American citizens, and for the most of them came after the 1967 war, and they were most of them between in their 40s, 50s, maybe 60s. Very well established and very successful American citizens. They have businesses, they have beautiful homes, they're very well established. The Palestinians that I interviewed in Jordan similarly had that unbelievable compassion and love for Palestine in their home, but their socioeconomic status was not as good as the American Palestinians. And I think that overall of course, it's gonna have an effect on one's experiences in life. The Palestinians in Jordan definitely felt as though they were still they didn't have as much equality as they wanted in Jordan. They didn't have enough ability to make money, bring kids to school, although some of them were incredibly successful. In fact, most of the businesses and entrepreneurs in Jordan, a lot of them actually are Palestinians. So some do incredibly well. But there was definitely a difference. Just the way that they live their daily lives in America versus in Jordan is very different. But that sense of home and homeland was incredibly strong for both of them. The American Palestinians, they define themselves, they are American. They love this country. They love being here. This is home to them. But they also had a stronger sense of I remember one man I remember telling me, he's probably early 50s or so in Dearborn, telling me he's living, he would never move his family from Dearborn, but when he dies, he needs to be buried in Palestine.
It's very striking, actually.
Yeah. So that was very similar.
And you've done some recent field work devoted to Syrian women refugees. Can you discuss a few of your findings?
Sure. So the Syrian Refugee Project is the first time I've done work that didn't have anything to do with maps. So this has been a bit of a departure. I've been working on this project for a little over 2 years now. It's been very different. It's dealing with dusty old maps is one thing. Dealing with Palestinians who are relatively well established is another thing. But dealing with and interviewing and talking with Syrian women who just fled a war and lost their home, their livelihoods, and family members is a very different project. So I'm still grappling and trying to figure out how exactly to disseminate this and how to analyze it and what my findings really are, because it's a very different type of work than I've done before. And I'll be, presenting on it, later today. This was an interesting project for me as a researcher because I went there thinking I was going to talk to these women about their national identity. And when I got there and I started listening to what they had to say, I realized that my interests as an academic were not relevant for them. It didn't matter. They didn't care about their national identity. They cared about their security, their safety, and the well-being of their children. So the project changed really quickly for me. And the project turned into my findings, and kind of answer your question, what my findings were so far doing this research is that they want to work for pay. And it was a really striking thing to go there and listen to them and hear repeatedly that, once they had a place to live, whether it was kind of a meager apartment or a horrible tent. But once they felt like established and safe away from, physical danger, they were focused on, okay, what can I do to work to make money so we can get some good food, get some chicken, and get my kids off to school. And there was such a sense of ingenuity and resilience in what they wanted to do that, it was so humbling to me that these women could overcome these outrageous obstacles, both material and psychological, and survive and go on and do these things. So my finding, a lot of it that I've been writing about, I haven't published this yet, but it's about work. It's about patriarchy, and it's about women who typically would not be in a position of leaving the household and earning an income, and how in these really horrible conditions of displacement, they have actually been doing that they have overcome not only the traumas of war and displacement, but they're also overcoming and challenging very firmly entrenched patriarchal norms about who works and who provides for the family. So that's.
Do you think that those challenges would not have been pursued had they remained in Syria?
Yes. Though, yes, the opportunities that most of them have for work now, and I don't want to sugarcoat. Some of the work they're doing is it's exploitative, and it's horrible. But they also at the same time talk about they've gained so much strength and confidence that they're doing things they never thought they would be able to do. They're gaining stature in the household. They're getting respect from male family members who are like, I can't believe you're doing all these things. This is amazing. It's stressful. They're burdened, still taking care of their family, and now they're working as well. They have a lot of things going on, but they still spoke incredibly positively about the experience of working. And yes, and for the majority of them, some of them had worked in Syria. A lot of them had college degrees but didn't work. A lot of them, and which is pretty common. They'll have an education, but then they get married, they have children, and they stay at home and they're taking care of the household and the family. A few of them did work in Syria, not that many. And most of the women who were then working in Jordan, which as the project kind of progressed, I was interviewing only women who were working. I didn't go with that intention, but that's what it turned into, because that's what ended up being most important. And a lot of the work they did, some of them were doing work that's, was in an office building, and they were doing work for an NGO, and it was relatively safe, good conditions. Other women were, kind of moving house to house, doing cleaning. Some women were tutoring, teaching. But a lot of them, they found that they were also usually working with Syrian communities in Jordan. So they felt like they were helping other Syrians. And that was another thing that for them it was a way to kind of deal with some of their trauma. They were giving back to the other Syrians in their community. They were teaching children. They were working in hospitals. They were doing some healthcare counseling. So they felt like it was such a rewarding thing for them just to be helping other Syrians. And yes, it was to answer your question.
This is fascinating because it appears to represent a remarkably rapid socioeconomic shift. It's happening over a very short period of time.
Incredibly rapid. And it's so transformative. They're overcoming so many different cultural norms. And at the same time, these cultural norms are being reified. They're constantly being reminded, because they are, as they're breaking over some of these barriers, the barrier becomes the very evident material thing that's making them realize that they're breaking over something, So, and there's backlash. I don't want to sugarcoat it. There's a lot of problems.
Sure.
With it. Some of the work is very exploitative. It creates tensions in the household. There is very little work for Syrian refugees in Jordan, period. In fact, it's illegal for most of them to work. For them to get a work permit, it's very, very difficult. There's been it was only about 3 months ago, where a handful of multinationals, a couple of different organizations in the EU worked with the Jordanian government, and they created something called the Jordan Compact. And this compact was basically creating special economic zones in Jordan that would allow Syrians to work and produce products that then they could sell to Europe without tariffs. So, it seemed like it was a good idea. It's slow getting going, and it's really not going to alleviate all of the labor issues or lack of jobs for Syrians in Jordan, but it's going to help. something
There's
is,
an effort being
there's
made
an effort. People
in the right
yes.
direction.
People recognize aid organizations, the UNHCR, Jordan, the government. They recognize that this is a huge, huge, huge problem. So they're trying. They're doing something. They're trying to make it work, but it's still very difficult for it to work. For Syrians to work in Jordan. And often what ends up happening is the jobs that become available are very low paying, they're non-skilled work, and the sense of being work that's often for women. So men who used to be the primary income earners, the breadwinners, the head of household, now they're not. And it's the woman that's going out there, the women are tutoring, they're maybe cooking, they're doing cleaning work and healthcare. They're doing what's typically considered very gendered, very feminine type of work, because that's all that's available. So the men are at home, and it creates problems. It creates a lot of tensions because the men, they want to provide and want to maintain that role that they had in Syria, and they can't. So I mean, there's not. I had not done research on this, but there's a lot of other research reports that come from CARE, an organization called CARE that works in Jordan. They work globally. The UNHCR as well, have a lot of reports about increased domestic violence, as there's a backlash when men feel as though their roles have been, and their dominance in the household has been taken away from them, that there's backlash. I'm not sugarcoating what women are doing there, but still at the same time, they've had these amazing changes in their personality and in their outlook in life, and there's good and bad mixed in there.
You've discussed Kim England's work as a way in which context has been applied really to your efforts to engage in this kind of study. Mm-hmm. Would you care to elaborate?
Yeah, Kim England wrote the seminal piece in the 90s. So I mean, she kind of really helped to develop the work within feminist geography and feminist geopolitics. And I mean, there's so many others, that has done work like her. I think more recently, and with a stronger angle towards looking at displacement and migration, would be Alison Mounts, who I was very fortunate to have on my dissertation committee. The idea behind this is that we need to step back from the way in which we hear about war and displacement, for that matter. That it's, knowing that there are 13.5 million Syrian refugees is important. That statistic is startling, right? That's this 13.5 million displaced Syrians is the population of Wisconsin and Michigan added together. It's immense. But that isn't the same, that doesn't communicate the same meaning as me telling you the story about Fatima, which, the story about this 19-year-old woman who comes to Jordan from Syria, who had just had her first child, whose husband has to go to the UAE to earn money. She's on her own. She's never had a job a day in her life. She becomes a teacher. She starts doing artwork. She changes her community through all this art that she's doing. So the statistic matters. But I feel that Fatima matters. And it's the work from Kim England, and it's work also, some degree from Alison Mounts. It tells you that, or suggests that listening to these very humanizing stories is as much about geopolitics as that statistic is. And that we can really, and I hope and I believe this, that we can really humanize people by telling their stories. And it's difficult. I mean, it's difficult to give an executive summary about 8 different lives and the complicated different aspects of their lives when a statistic often, takes one sentence. There's a lot more complexity when we're talking about human beings at that type of level. But yeah, that's what, a lot of what I think Kim England has done and a lot of other people have done is that, we need to kind of scale down. And we need to look at the individual, and obviously part of a much wider, society and, a whole bunch of other different structures and processes. But the individual matters immensely. There's a huge media kind of attention towards this really fascinating study that was done by a Chinese scholar where he looked at nighttime mapping in Syria. I wish I could remember his name. It was about a year and a half or so ago where he did composite images of satellite photographs were taken over Syria starting in 2011, just before the war really kind of broke out. And then he compared them to images that were in 2014. And it's probably not a big surprise, but the lights went out, right? And I mean, it's amazing. And you can just look at these two maps side by side and you get a real sense of just how the infrastructure has been, just dismantled, and that people aren't there. They're not turning on their lights. Like something has changed hugely. And I saw lots of reports about this, and I love it. I think it's really great work, and those things need to happen. But you miss the people in that.
Absolutely.
You know, there's no human life that's happening in those images. And I think a lot of the work of feminist geography, it just tells you you need to look at the people who get lost in these type of stories, and you need to look at how they're being affected, their daily lives are being affected. And that's what I've been trying to do with the Syrian women, that their daily lives were affected. You know, when the lights went off in Dara, which you can see in this map, right? They ended up fleeing to Jordan, and then they end up working in a meager job, and maybe there's some tensions in their household for it, but their personalities are changing, their outlook on life is changing. Like there's so much more to that story of war and geopolitics and conflict than we
If
usually.
we're going to care about these marginalized people, then we need to learn to understand their stories and appreciate that, really, that you and others are pursuing that very difficult task. Just a couple more quick questions, and one is this. Here you are, an associate professor at WVU. You are married to an academic geographer. You have children. How do you navigate your field work, your publications, your married life, your children? How do you do all this?
I mean, people do it. I mean, people do it. I'm not the only one. I mean, you know, there's a lot of demands. There's a lot of juggling. You know, right now I'm here in Grand Rapids, and I'm loving my trip here. My husband's giving a conference in New York, and my mother is taking care of my children right now. I mean, it takes a lot of help. It takes a lot of assistance. You know, I wish I slept more. You know, I have awesome colleagues, amazing colleagues who are also my friends at WVU. We definitely, a lot of them also have small, young children. We definitely have a nice support system amongst one another. Yeah, it's just, you make it work. There's challenges. There's days I wish I got more sleep, but, you know, you make it work. And I have a really good support system.
That's great. Lastly, do you have any suggestions for aspiring geographers? Young people interested in pursuing geography as a field?
To have teachers like you. Yeah, I mean, it's been your students. You can tell, like you cultivate students. I mean, I think that you have at GRCC, you have this really amazing opportunity to really cultivate your undergrads. And maybe this is to kind of come back to the question you just asked me. We had. You know, we do undergraduate teaching, but we're also doing so much research and writing grants and publications that we don't focus on our students as much as I think you probably have the opportunity to focus on your students here. So I think for aspiring geographers, we need to find the mentor that can really nurture them. It's a challenge. It's a challenge to do that. And I have a handful of students I feel like I've been able to do that to, but I probably should have done it, you know, 10 times more than I have. So to find the mentor, I guess my advice is to find the mentor, and to realize that there's bumps along the way, you know, and that and to check your ego. That's a good one. To just try to get rid of the ego and just, you know, kind of just do what you want to do and be honest to yourself and kind of check the ego at the door. And
Well, thank you so much for the very kind words, and thank you for being here today.
Yeah, it's been a great visit.
This concludes our session of Conversation with the Geographer. Thank you.